The sharp February wind, an unforgiving presence this time of year, whipped off Lake Ontario, carrying with it the metallic tang of exhaust fumes mingling with the fainter, more comforting scent of distant wood smoke. It snaked through the narrow, brick-lined streets of Parkdale, finding every gap in Liam's defenses. He pulled his worn wool scarf tighter around his neck, the coarse fabric chafing slightly, but the collar of his faded denim jacket offered little real protection against the biting cold that seemed to sink deep into his bones. Each breath plumed in a thick, white cloud, momentarily obscuring his vision before dissolving quickly into the uniform gray of the Toronto sky. He hunched his shoulders, hands shoved deep into his pockets, the chill a constant reminder of the long walk home from Manolo's garage. His mind, however, drifted to warmth. He thought of Clara, her laughter, the way her eyes would crinkle at the corners when he told one of his truly awful jokes, even after a long, exhausting day on her feet at Eaton's. Their small apartment, perched above the perpetual hum of the laundromat on Queen Street West, felt like the only true sanctuary in a city that seemed to be tightening its grip, growing colder and harder by the day. He pictured the chipped ceramic mugs they shared for their morning coffee, the way the late afternoon sun, when it bothered to show itself, would catch the dust motes dancing in the air above their cluttered bookshelf. It was a modest life, certainly, filled with hand-me-down furniture and the constant negotiation of space, but it was theirs. It was a refuge. As he turned the key in the lock, the familiar scent of home washed over him, thick with the comforting aroma of Clara's lentil soup, simmering gently on the stove. Inside, the radio played softly, a forgotten pop song from a few years back, its melody a gentle, nostalgic hum. Clara herself stood at the counter, her back to him, humming along, her auburn hair pulled back in a loose ponytail that swayed with each rhythmic chop of her knife. She was dicing onions with quick, efficient movements, her hands sure and practiced. She turned as he entered, the sound of the door closing behind him, and a smile brightened her face, chasing away some of the weariness that often settled there. Yet, a faint line of worry, almost imperceptible to anyone but him, was etched between her brows, a subtle furrow that hadn't been there a year ago. "You're late, love," she said, her voice soft, but with an underlying current of concern that reached him even across the small kitchen. "Everything all right?" Liam shrugged out of his jacket, the denim stiff and cold, and hung it carefully on the hook by the door, trying to appear nonchalant. "Just a slow day," he replied, keeping his tone even. Mr. Henderson brought in his old Nova, swore up and down it was the transmission, but it turned out to be nothing more than a loose belt. Took him ages to pay, even then. Said he had to go to the bank, then his wife needed to approve it, then he forgot his wallet. He trailed off, offering a small, tired smile. He didn't mention the hushed conversation he'd overheard between old Manolo, the garage owner, and his son, about cutting hours, about the dwindling number of cars coming in for anything more than a routine oil change. The words, tightening belts, and barely breaking even, still echoed in his head, but he swallowed them down, not wanting to add to the worry already visible on Clara's face. "Smells good," he offered instead, trying to lighten the mood, and moved towards her, leaning in to kiss her temple. Her skin felt warm against his lips, a welcome contrast to the cold outside, and he lingered there for a moment, drawing comfort from her presence. Clara stirred the soup, the ladle clinking softly against the pot's rim, her gaze fixed on the swirling lentils. "We need to talk about the rent, Liam," she said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper, but the words hung heavy in the air between them, a familiar refrain of their growing anxieties. "Mrs. Petrova stopped by again today. She said if it's late next month, she'll have to consider other options." She didn't look up, but he felt the weight of her words, the unspoken implication of what other options might mean. They'd been late twice now, a source of constant, gnawing stress that burrowed into their evenings. Liam knew the drill, he just didn't have an answer. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, a gesture of frustration and helplessness. "I know, Clara, I know. I'll ask Manolo about some overtime, maybe take on a weekend job. Anything." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. They both knew Manolo was barely keeping the garage afloat, his own face etched with worry lines that mirrored Clara's. The unemployment numbers on the evening news were a constant, grim backdrop to their lives, a relentless drone of bad tidings. Every night, the local newscaster, his face grim and unsmiling, would detail another factory closure, another round of layoffs. The city, once so vibrant and full of promise, was bleeding jobs, slowly, inexorably. One evening, after a meager supper of toast and canned beans, the silence in the apartment felt particularly oppressive. Liam sat hunched over the kitchen table, the dim bulb above casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the slightest movement. He was poring over the classifieds in the Toronto Star, his finger tracing lines of tiny print, the newsprint leaving smudges on his skin. Mechanic wanted, must have owned tools, experienced in imports. He circled it with a blunt pencil, a flicker of something that might have been hope igniting in his eyes, only to dim almost immediately as he saw the location. Mississauga. An hour-long bus ride each way, he calculated, if he could even get the job. The thought of adding another 2 hours to his already long day, on top of the uncertainty of the interview itself, weighed heavily. Clara watched him from the worn armchair in the corner, her head bent over a tear in his favorite sweater, her needle clicking softly as she mended the fabric. The silence in the room was thick, punctuated only by the rhythmic click of her needle and the distant, mournful wail of a siren cutting through the night. She didn't say anything, but her gaze, when it occasionally lifted to meet his, spoke volumes. "Did Manolo say anything else today?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper, thin as the thread she was trying to pull through a needle. The late afternoon light, already fading, cast long, tired shadows across their small kitchen. Liam sighed, the sound heavy, leaning back in his chair which creaked under his weight, a familiar protest. He watched the dust motes dance in the last rays of sun, unable to meet her gaze directly. "He's letting go of young Tony next week," Liam finally said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He shifted, his hand going to the back of his neck, rubbing at a knot that had been there for days. "Says he can't afford to keep 3 mechanics anymore. Might have to cut me down to 4 days soon, too." The announcement felt like a physical punch to his gut, a sickening blow that left him winded, and he could see the same impact register on Clara's face, her hand freezing mid-stitch. Tony, barely 20, was just out of high school, full of a boundless energy Liam remembered having once himself, and now he was out on the street, adrift. The injustice of it, the sheer helplessness, settled like a cold stone in Liam's chest. Clara's lips pressed together, a silent acknowledgement of the tightening noose around them both. She didn't ask what they would do, because the question hung, unspoken and terrifying, between them. The following week brought no good news, only the slow, grinding reality of their new normal. Liam worked his reduced hours, the garage feeling emptier, the air colder, not just from the autumn chill creeping in, but from the absence of Tony's cheerful whistling, Manolo's booming laughter. Each day felt like a countdown, a waiting game for the next shoe to drop. He tried to busy himself, cleaning tools that were already spotless, sweeping floors that held no new grime, anything to avoid the quiet. Clara's shifts at Eaton's were also cut back, the store seeing fewer shoppers, the aisles quieter than usual, the hushed atmosphere a mirror of their own home. She'd come home looking pale, her smile a little too tight, the weight of unsold sweaters and unused credit cards pressing down on her. They started making a game of it, a dark humor shielding them from the creeping despair. "What can we make with 1 potato and half an onion tonight?" Clara would ask, a forced lilt in her voice as she rummaged through the sparse pantry. Liam would play along, suggesting outlandish, impossible meals, trying to coax a genuine laugh from her. But the laughter felt brittle, easily broken, a fragile shield against the constant gnawing worry that had taken up permanent residence in their small apartment. The nights were long, filled with the rustle of turning pages from books they couldn't concentrate on, the low hum of the refrigerator, and the louder hum of unspoken fears. Sometimes, Liam would reach for Clara's hand across the worn sofa, a silent anchor in their storm. One Saturday morning, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee, Liam was in the kitchen, wrestling with their temperamental toaster. It had a habit of either incinerating bread or merely warming it to a pale, unappetizing state, much like their current existence. He had a screwdriver in hand, muttering curses under his breath, when the phone, perched precariously on a stack of outdated phone books, rang with an abrupt, startling jolt. It was Manolo. Liam's hand tightened on the receiver, his knuckles white against the pale plastic, the sudden tension in his body palpable. He listened, his face draining of color, a slow, horrifying pallor spreading from his jawline upwards. He didn't say much, just a few clipped, "Yes, Manolo," and "I understand." Then, slowly, deliberately, he put the phone back down. The click echoed in the sudden silence. He turned to Clara, who had stopped folding laundry on the kitchen table, her movements arrested, her eyes wide with apprehension, already knowing. She had seen that look on his face before, in the faces of other men at the pub when the news was bad. "He's closing the garage, Clara," Liam said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, as if the words were too heavy to carry any inflection. "End of the month. Can't make it work anymore. Says he's sorry." But his eyes, when they finally met hers, held a depth of panic she hadn't seen before, a raw, naked fear that mirrored her own. The toaster, still stubbornly refusing to toast, sat mockingly on the counter, a symbol of their inability to even fix the smallest things. The dream of their own little house, of children, of a life free from the constant, relentless gnawing worry, seemed to crumble into dust around them, leaving only the bitter taste of shattered hope. The weeks that followed were a blur of fruitless job applications and crisp, impersonal rejection letters that piled up on the kitchen table like accusations. Liam walked the streets of Toronto, his worn boots pounding the pavement, the soles growing thinner with each passing day. He visited every greasy garage, every dusty repair shop, every echoing factory with a "Help Wanted" sign tacked crookedly to a door, only to be met with the same apologetic shakes of the head, the same weary, almost rehearsed phrases. "Sorry, son, no room," or "We're actually laying off next month, not hiring." Each refusal chipped away at him, a slow erosion of spirit. His pride, once a sturdy shield, began to fray at the edges, leaving him feeling exposed and raw. He started staying out later, sometimes just walking aimlessly through the darkening streets, the cold autumn wind biting at his ears, sometimes nursing a single, watery beer at the local pub, the dim lights and stale air a temporary refuge. He'd listened to other men talk, their voices low and heavy with their own struggles, their own lost jobs, a shared litany of misfortune. The camaraderie was thin, laced with a bitter despair that offered little comfort. He would return home exhausted, the faint scent of stale beer clinging to his clothes, the smell a silent accusation. He'd find Clara waiting up for him, curled on the sofa with a book she wasn't reading, her face a mask of weary patience, a subtle disappointment in her eyes that he couldn't quite meet. Clara, meanwhile, was picking up whatever extra shifts she could at Eaton's, even if it meant working in departments she disliked, dealing with increasingly frustrated customers who snapped over trivial matters. She sold off a few of her grandmother's old trinkets at a pawn shop near Kensington Market, the small sum feeling like a betrayal of family history but an undeniable necessity. The money, a handful of crumpled bills, went straight to groceries, to the hydro bill, to keeping the lights on. She stopped buying herself anything new, not even a cheap lipstick to brighten her tired face. Her worn coat, thin against the autumn chill that had already begun to creep into every corner of the city, was a constant, itchy reminder of their precarious state, a second skin of anxiety. One evening, the silence in the apartment felt particularly heavy, almost suffocating. Clara found Liam staring out the window, his back to her, his shoulders slumped, the set of his head conveying a profound weariness. She approached him cautiously, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "Did you hear back from that place in Scarborough?" she asked gently, knowing the answer already, dreading the confirmation. He didn't turn, his gaze fixed on the grimy brick wall of the building opposite. They hired someone with 10 years more experience, he said, his voice rough, choked with a frustration that felt like it was slowly, irrevocably turning into resignation. For half the pay I used to get. He didn't add anything else, but the unspoken words hung in the air. What's the point? The tension in their small apartment grew palpable, a silent, suffocating presence that filled the space between them, pushing them apart. They stopped talking about the future. The dreams they'd once shared now seemed cruel mockeries, ghosts of a happier time. Their conversations became clipped, practical, revolving solely around bills and food, a desperate accounting of their dwindling resources. One evening, a heated argument erupted over a broken light fixture in the bathroom. It wasn't about the fixture at all, but the mounting pressure, the unspoken fear that had festered into resentment. Liam snapped at Clara for suggesting he try construction work, something he had no experience in, his voice sharp with wounded pride, the words coming out harsher than he intended. Clara, her own patience worn thin, retorted about his refusal to consider anything outside of mechanics, accusing him of stubbornness, of burying his head in the sand. Tears welled in her eyes, not from anger, but from a profound, bone-deep sadness. "We can't even afford to fix a light bulb, Liam," she cried, her voice cracking, echoing slightly in the small room. "What are we going to do?" He stood there, helpless, watching her tears, wishing he had an answer, wishing he could fix it all, but the words wouldn't come. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument, a chasm opening between them. Then, a letter arrived. Stark and official, the envelope thick and unyielding in Clara's hand, bearing the familiar cursive of Mrs. Petrova, their landlady. It was an eviction notice. They were 2 months behind on rent, and she could no longer wait. They had 3 weeks. The paper shook in Clara's hand as she read it aloud to Liam, who sat across from her at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the chipped formica, his eyes fixed on a hairline crack in the surface. 3 weeks, Liam, she whispered, her voice devoid of emotion, a hollow sound. Where will we go? Liam finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers, full of a desperate, hunted look she recognized instantly. He had seen it in the eyes of other men at the pub, men who had lost everything, men who had nowhere left to go. He couldn't let that happen to Clara. He wouldn't. That night, they lay in bed, side by side, but miles apart, separated by the crushing weight of the eviction notice and the unspoken terror it brought. The usual comfort of their shared warmth was replaced by a cold dread that seeped into the sheets. Liam traced the outline of Clara's arm with his finger, a gesture that once held simple tenderness, now felt like a desperate, silent plea. "I saw an ad today," he began, his voice barely audible in the dark, a fragile thread in the oppressive quiet. "For rig hands. Up north. Alberta." Clara stiffened beside him. The oil boom in Alberta was a distant, almost mythical thing they'd heard about, whispered about in hushed tones at the pub. A place where men could still find work, but it was a world away from Toronto, from everything they knew. "Alberta?" she whispered, turning to face him, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes, even in the dim light filtering through the window, were wide with a new kind of fear, a fear of the unknown, of separation. "For how long? What about us?" Liam pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the familiar scent of her shampoo, trying to anchor himself. "I don't know, love," he murmured, his voice muffled against her scalp. "A few months, maybe a year. Just until we get back on our feet. I could send money back. Enough for you to stay here, or find somewhere cheaper. We could start again." The words sounded hollow, even to his own ears, a thin promise against the vastness of their uncertainty. He knew the unspoken truth. A few months could turn into forever, a chasm that might never close. The discussion that followed over the next few days was excruciating, each word a painful choice, each silence heavier than the last. They weighed the options, few and grim, turning them over and over like smooth, cold stones. Moving in with Clara's parents was out of the question. Her father had just been laid off from the steel plant. another casualty of the shifting economy, and their small house was already bursting with relatives, a multi-generational tangle of anxieties. Liam's family was in Ireland, an impossible distance, a world away. The thought of him leaving, of them being apart, felt like tearing a part of themselves away, a limb amputated without anesthetic. Clara pictured her life without him, the apartment feeling even emptier, the city even colder, the quiet unbearable. But she also saw his desperation, the quiet shame that had begun to settle over him like a shroud, dimming the light in his eyes. She couldn't bear to see him broken, not truly. "What if I came with you?" she asked one morning, her voice small, barely a breath, as they sat over cooling mugs of tea. Liam shook his head, his gaze fixed on the street below, on a lone bus rumbling past. "No, love. It's rough work. And living arrangements, not for you. Besides, you'd lose your job here, and what if it doesn't work out? Then we'd both be stranded, thousands of miles from anything." His logic was brutal, undeniable, a stark reflection of the harsh reality they faced. He didn't look at her as he spoke, perhaps unable to bear the pain in her eyes. The decision, when it finally came, wasn't a shouted agreement or a passionate declaration, but a quiet, tearful surrender. A slow, agonizing capitulation to forces far beyond their control. They sat on their threadbare sofa, the eviction notice a stark white rectangle on the coffee table between them, a silent, damning testament to their failure. Clara held Liam's hand, her fingers intertwined with his, clinging to the last vestiges of their shared physical presence, the warmth of his skin a fleeting comfort. "You had to go," she said, her voice barely a whisper, a single tear tracing a hot path down her cheek, tasting of salt and sorrow. "We can't keep going like this. We're drowning." The words hung in the stale air of their nearly empty apartment, a heavy, unshakable truth. Liam had simply nodded, his own eyes brimming, reflecting the dim light from the single bare bulb overhead. "I'll come back for you, Clara. As soon as I can. We'll make this work." But even as he spoke, the conviction in his voice wavered, a fragile promise easily broken by the vast, unforgiving distance and the relentless economic tide that had already stripped them of so much. They both knew, deep down, that the love they had built, strong and vibrant through lean years and shared laughter, was now being slowly, painfully dismantled by forces entirely beyond their control. The recession wasn't just taking their jobs or their home. It was taking their future, piece by agonizing piece, leaving behind a hollow ache where dreams used to live. The morning Liam left, the sky was a bruised purple, promising snow that hadn't yet begun to fall. He stood on the platform at Union Station, the cold wind whipping around them, a worn duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The Greyhound bus to Edmonton idled nearby, its engine a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the concrete, a sound that felt like the engine of their separation. Clara clutched her own small overnight case, its weight negligible compared to the lump in her throat. She had spent their last night together in a cheap motel near the station, unable to bear the thought of sleeping in their now empty apartment. The furniture had been sold or given away, the walls echoing with their absence, each creak a reminder of what was lost. She wore the blue scarf he'd given her for her last birthday, pulling it tight around her face, trying to hold onto his scent, the fading memory of his embrace. His hand, calloused from years of construction work, found hers, squeezing it tightly, a desperate attempt to convey everything that couldn't be spoken. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic declarations left in them. Their words had been exhausted in the long, silent days and tearful nights leading up to this moment. "You take care of yourself, Clara," he said, his voice thick with unshed emotion, a raw edge of despair. His eyes scanned her face, memorizing every detail: the curve of her cheek, the faint freckles across her nose, the way her lips trembled slightly. He looked tired, older than his 28 years, the hopeful spark that had always defined him dulled by worry and the crushing weight of responsibility. Clara nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight, a dam holding back a torrent of tears. She wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him they would find a way, anyway, together, even if it meant living on bread and water. But the stark image of the eviction notice, the empty fridge, the silent, bitter arguments born of desperation, flashed through her mind. This was the only path they had left, a brutal, necessary amputation. He leaned down, pressing a long, lingering kiss to her lips, a kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow, a silent goodbye to a future they had so desperately wanted to build. Then, with a final, heartbreaking squeeze of her hand, he turned and boarded the bus, disappearing into the crowded aisle. Clara watched through the grimy window as he found a seat near the back, his silhouette framed against the dim interior, a ghost already. The bus shuddered, then slowly began to pull away, the exhaust fumes mingling with the biting cold air, a bitter perfume of departure. She stood there, frozen, until the red taillights vanished around a bend, taking a piece of her heart with them, leaving her hollowed out and exposed to the raw wind. Clara moved into a tiny, cramped room in a boarding house in Little Portugal. A place she could barely afford even with her reduced hours at Eton's. The room smelled faintly of mildew and stale cigarette smoke, a suffocating mix that clung to her clothes and hair. The wallpaper peeled in the corners, revealing patches of faded plaster, a stark, painful contrast to the bright, sun-filled apartment she had shared with Liam, where every morning had felt like a fresh beginning. Every night, by the weak glow of a bedside lamp, she wrote him letters, long, rambling accounts of her day, the mundane details of her new, solitary life. She described her work at Eton's, the changing window displays, the small talk with customers, the rain on Queen Street. She filled pages with questions she couldn't bring herself to ask about his life, afraid of the answers. She never mentioned her loneliness or the persistent ache in her chest that felt like a permanent fixture, or the cold, gnawing fear that whispered in the quiet hours. She just hoped he was well, that he was finding work, that the vast distance wasn't making him forget the Clara he had loved. His letters came back sporadically, postmarked from Fort McMurray, his once neat handwriting now smudged with grease and dirt, brief and practical. He spoke of long shifts on the rigs, the harsh, unforgiving conditions, the biting cold of the north that seeped into his bones. He always ended with, "Missing you, love," but the words felt increasingly distant, hollowed out by the miles. A perfunctory closing rather than a heartfelt yearning. Months turned into a year. The recession lingered, a stubborn, gray shadow over the city, touching everyone. Clara was promoted to assistant manager in the ladies' accessories department at Eton's, a small victory that felt profoundly bittersweet. She had saved a little money, enough to consider a slightly better room, perhaps one without the pervasive smell of mildew. But the thought of a future, of their future, remained a nebulous, unreachable thing, a mirage shimmering just beyond her grasp. One crisp autumn afternoon, almost 18 months after Liam had left, a letter arrived, thicker than usual. Her hands trembled as she saw the familiar postmark, the scrawled address. A sudden, irrational surge of hope flared in her chest, quickly followed by a cold dread. She tore open the envelope, her fingers clumsy, and inside found a neatly folded letter and a money order. Her eyes fell on the money order first, a stark, unexpected green rectangle that felt impossibly heavy in her palm. Then she unfolded the letter. It was short, formal, his familiar handwriting feeling foreign, detached. He had found steady work, good work, but it was in Alberta. He was settling in, making a life there. He wished her well. He said he would always cherish their time together, but that the distance, the different paths they were now on, had made it impossible to bridge the gap. He was letting her go. The money order, she realized, was for her, a final gesture, to help her get started anew, a severance from a love that had simply run out of resources, a final accounting of a debt that could never be repaid. Clara sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the letter and the money order clutched in her hands, her world silent except for the frantic, hollow beating of her own heart. There were no tears, not at first. Just a profound, aching emptiness, a confirmation of the fear she had lived with for so long, a fear that had finally materialized into stark, undeniable words. The Toronto sun, usually so vibrant in autumn, seemed to dim outside her window, casting long, mournful shadows across the peeling wallpaper. She looked at the money order, a symbol of his success and of their failure. It wasn't about money anymore, not really. It was about what money had done to them. It had chipped away at their dreams, eroded their patience, twisted their hope, and finally, driven them apart, leaving them with nothing but the ghost of a love they simply couldn't afford to keep alive. She folded the letter carefully, her movements slow and deliberate, as if performing a sacred ritual. She tucked it into a small wooden box where she kept a dried rose from their first date, its petals brittle and faded, a relic of a sweeter time. The recession had taken so much from so many, but for Clara and Liam, it had taken the most precious thing of all. The city outside continued its relentless hum, a symphony of traffic and distant sirens, indifferent to the quiet heartbreak unfolding within its walls. She knew she had to keep going, to build a life, to find a new path, but a part of her would forever remain on that cold platform at Union Station, watching a Greyhound bus disappear into the distance, carrying away not just Liam, but the girl she used to be, full of hopeful dreams and a love that believed it could conquer anything. The blue scarf, still draped over the back of her chair, caught a sliver of the fading light, a silent, soft reminder of a touch she would always remember. How was the story today? I want to show you a memorable scene. If there's a moment that overlaps with my memory, the story of that time, the scenery in my memory that I used to go to often, I feel for someone I can't meet anymore, the small things that come to mind right now, please leave it as a detail. If you're curious about a story that's released at the same time every day, subscriptions and notification settings are very helpful in creating videos.